Annie, I know all about that day 100 years ago, all about the flood. We have the internet. I know you sold this photo to the Lowell City engineers. And you sold a similar scene to the Lowell Sun. And the proprietors of locks and canals, the big shots who supplied the water power to the mills. I know you were scrappy. I know of your 3,000 photos I've seen, this is one of your best. I'd like to know, what were you thinking when you set it up? Was it difficult to get the boys to follow your instructions? Your West Yorkshire English accent might have been difficult. Were you thinking of the story of God's devastating flood and the peace that followed? I know that understanding the Bible was central to your life. I don't actually talk to Annie Powell, but she was a real person who lived 92 years, 1859 to 1952, and this is her in the Lowell Highlands neighborhood in the last few years of her life. A remarkable person who took photos for 65 years. She was unknown to historians and even her descendants until 2 years ago. That's when I committed to finding everything about her. Here's her brief biography. Annie Powell, born Elizabeth Hannah Townend, goes by Annie from a young age. Second of 7 children, father is a farm worker. Even as she attends grade school, she works at the local textile mill. By age 12, managers promoted her to the position of head doffer. Precocious. She owns her first camera by age 15. How do we know that? Here's a snapshot of Annie and her sister at the neighborhood tennis courts or bowling greens. She is at her right, and to her right, look at that black object next to her. It's a box camera. She marries John Powell at age 21. They have no children. Their marriage is troubled. By 1881, the two acquire a photo studio, probably from a bankruptcy auction. From the start, evidence suggests they pursue independent careers. Age 33, she follows her uncle, older sister, and brother-in-law to Lowell for outside photo work. She arrives about 6 months ahead of her husband. Likely her brother-in-law had secured a contract with the proprietors of Locks and Canals. After several studios in the Grove neighborhood near the Concord River, they lose their house and business. For about 12 years, she separates from John. He becomes an eyeglass fitter. She sells outside photos to proprietors of Locks and Canals, city engineers, housing authority, postcard publishers. She has a special connection to the Portuguese American community. She provides them historically important portraits in the mills and outside their homes. 1914, joins Primitive Methodist Church, later renamed Matthew's Memorial. Significantly, she registers herself as head of household. This is an invented household, being herself and 2 unmarried sisters who did not actually live in the same house. 1952, dies in Niece's home at 63 Harris Avenue in the Highlands section. Annie and I overlap on this earth by 8 months. She leaves photo scrapbooks and glass plate negatives. 69 years pass. I locate her final effects. That's the starting point for linking her work to 3,000 anonymous images. She didn't help her place in history. She didn't sign her work or sign with initials that seemed to be her personal pen name. Here's her interview with the Lowell Sun on her 90th birthday in 1949. I was once a reporter and contributed a few to this genre of sweet old lady stories. This is about 8 years after she took her final professional photos, this time for the Housing Authority, but given her chance, She apparently didn't mention her distinguished 65-year career. We're left with literally, she is the widow, this is at the end, she is the widow of John Powell, well-known photographer and optometrist. The well-known part was actually not true even in the Sun's own clipping library. The early edition of the Sun's obituary for John in 1928 said he was an optometrist and well-known photographer. The later edition, in the year-end summary of notable deaths, corrected the record to say he was just an optometrist. This is 63 Harris Avenue, where the interview took place. I have since found out her room was on the upper right. In 2021, I sent a letter to the residents here. I asked for information about this photo, which I believed was associated with her ancestor. I got a call when I was finishing up my first COVID shot. It was Bob Bacon, who grew up in this house. He didn't know where they came from, but his family kept hundreds of old photos and glass plate negatives. That was exciting. I offered Bob a theory. Maybe they were the final effects of his great-great-grand aunt. That would be Annie Powell. Here's a short version of why I wrote the letter. When I sent the letter, I was retired from careers in journalism and software. I was writing a music video, a ghost story about a mill worker from 1909. For the video, I found that image and had to use it. It was in a series of uncredited ones mysteriously brought to the University of Massachusetts Lowell in 1989. Something about a talented photographer that never got credit made me angry. As a former reporter, I figured, how hard could it be to discover the photographer? So I went with my first hunch. I matched it with this 1906 photo studio ad. So after Bob's call, the family helped inventory the house. For starters, it was pretty clear the current washer room was once Annie's darkroom. There's the original 1923 plumbing, soapstone sink, supply cabinet, probably even her chair. Her great-great-great-grandnieces Alexandria Healy and J.C. Desrochers took these pictures. Gone were the glass plate negatives. Probably this image and the others went to a collector in the early 1980s, which would be how it winded up at UMass Lowell in 1989. But Annie's final effects included her 1930 confirmation photo of her grandniece. Notice both are remarkably similar in pose. Relaxed, romantic, and active. We know Annie owned a high-end Bausch & Lomb diffusion lens. It would have cost $210 around 1910, or about $5,000 in today's dollars. That would account for the near identical soft focus on both. This is the Mill Girl negative. Tony Sampas at the Center for Lowell History set it up for me gingerly on a light table. I'd like to show you another similarity. It's really Annie's signature move, and that's painstaking negative retouching. She did that to place shadow and light for interest and composition. We don't have the negative for the confirmation photo, but my photo app renders this. Notice the way she thinned the negatives around the feet. This is a way of vignetting the figures, except most vignette in the printing step. She did it on the negative. Back to the positive to see what happened here. Notice the way she introduced softening shadows that point to the subject. Likely, a straight edge was used. So here we are back again with the final work. Of about 75 items she chose to keep in the last 3 years of her life, some were personal memories, like her mother and her 4 sisters back in Meltham. Likely, these are among the first photos she took around the mid-1870s. Here's a Powell studio photo she took of her niece, Emma Whiteley. These cute kids she took probably around the time of this 1896 ad. We are unexcelled in children's photos. Yes, she was unexcelled in that and something else we already saw in the kids on bicycles in the opening photo, and that's her ability to coax a great pose from anybody, including 3-year-olds. Okay, let's do a quick survey of other children's photos I attribute to Annie. This last was published in the Parks Department report. Annie's church would have been Bible conservative, but socially and politically liberal. That may illuminate Annie's decision to focus on the Asian girl at the right. And you might just admire the Parks Department's decision to publish the photo. This is 1916. There were a lot of family photos in her scrapbooks, but most notably, not a single photo of the man who loved displaying his Teddy Roosevelt mug, her husband. In fact, she actively cut off his memory with some drama. In 1899, she snapped this cabinet card of Annie Wood. That's her beloved niece who took her into her Harris Avenue home some 40 years later. Do you see how the bottom writing is snipped off? To the left, look at the bottom to see how the cabinet card would have looked before falling to the floor. So we're talking about J. Powell falling to the floor, and we're witness to a century-old drama. This is important. There were a few handwriting samples, and I added to this newly discovered church records and census entries to help understand her handwriting for forensics investigations. You may remember this printing at the bottom of the opening flood photo. I collaged photo bottom printing for the City Engineers and Housing Authority 1916 to 1940, 24 years. And a few weeks ago, I took this to an undergraduate forensic lab in the UMass Lowell Criminology Department. For 2 hours, among other things, they considered these questions. Was it the same person? And was that person Annie Powell? The answers to both? Very high probability, said the class and the professor. I mentioned, I think, about 3,000 anonymous photos in at least seven public and private places are actually Annie Powell's. They are also on postcards and several books, including the 1912 George Kengott book, The Record of a City. The 3,000 are remarkable in their forensic, stylistic, technical, and subject commonality. The vast majority have this in common: glass plate negatives, working people, outside, highly choreographed. They came from a unique kind of photographer, one who operated a 6.5 by 8.5 inch outside camera with top of the line lenses. Somebody who didn't mind leaving the studio in floods, snowstorms, summer heat. The talk's title says Annie hid in plain sight, so let's literally watch her at work. She used timers and pneumatic shutter releases. She used assistants. Her work for the city engineers is full of selfies. It's a good guess this would be her lower left, age 56, on Merrimack Street. Nice composition. Okay, would you believe this is her? It's 1927. She would be age 68. She seems posed as a lawyer crossing Lakeview Avenue at Bridge Street. Let's blow this up. We have several snapshots of Annie. This one is about 1945 with Sister Clara. So let's compare the 68-year-old Annie posing as a lawyer to her at 85. Same wiry frame, wide nose, good posture. This would be her crossing the street at age 66. We don't just have selfies, we have unintentional selfies. Take a look at the reflection in the window. Does it look like the woman on the right on the sidewalk? No, it's actually the photographer. She was 65 here. She would have been 63 in this photo a few weeks after the flood picture. This one's unusual in that she's not wearing one of her signature hats. Central Street, 1927. In style, unique among Annie's images. It's experimental, heavily retouched. It's existentially modern the way people are looking at everything else except each other. Focus is on the man who is looking at what's good today at the Waldorf. He's also looking at the reflection of the photographer. It takes a little imagination, but there is a woman in a hat above the camera. Okay, maybe an enlargement helps. She might have had another word for this, but to us, she was a photobomber. I think she found this fun or funny. The circa 1916 Model T Depot hack was in the Harris Avenue collection as a real photo postcard. In almost all cases, she puts the photo bomber at the left. And that's the case here. This one is the front page of our Annie Powell website. It's really the same pose as the previous photo, even the angle of leaning. This is from the 1912 book, The Record of a City. People leaning out of the windows is a common sight in an Annie Powell photo. We see 1, 2, 3 people in the back who are interrupting the photo. This is from the about 1919 and is part of the Portuguese American collection. It worked so well, she repeated it. This time, she ups the number by 2. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 are in the background. A little hard to see. Just to the left of that woman's head is the 5th. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And this is from the 1940s Housing Authority collection. It looks like somebody with a watering can. We may actually have a twofer here. The left window reflection may be the photographer. At first blush, this looks like a shadow selfie of the photographer. But this is basically a view to the north. It's not physically possible for the sun to be directly behind the photographer. No, the negative is retouched with some sort of a cartoon character. In the City Engineer series, we see this playful gesture at least 4 times. Here's one. As before, this is a sham shadow. You can see the angle is at odds with the other shadows. In this case, I think the shadow was put in for balance and composition and to be fun. This is part of the Portuguese Camara collection. This woman around 1912 was taken at Appleton Mills. She's sitting by a source of light to our left, a window, and yet there is a shadow on her left arm as if the light is coming from the right. This is dramatic effect she used a lot. I call it corridor of light. She sets up or enhances the negative to create light right down the middle. The one upper left is one of her gems owned by the Lowell Historical Society. It's worth looking at more closely. It shows a housekeeper serving tea to Anders and Adelaide Thomason around 1900. He owned a drugstore on Central Street and was very successful. Later was bought by Annie's niece by marriage. Talk about posing skills. Annie charmed a dog and a cat to cooperate in a wonderful scene of genteel pleasures. It's hard to deny the number of photos that have ominous men in her work. There are at least 30 in the City Engineer photos, almost all certainly her assigned driver. This last one is from the Housing Authority. Sometimes a religious story is more explicit, as in this image we saw earlier. This ominous man is particularly menacing, hiding and waiting behind the pole, waiting for Annie to cross. Annie set up the camera and he's operating the cable release probably. It's hard not to see this as an autobiographical tableau, something like, I prepared to cross Kirk Avenue aware an agent of God could be leading me into the next life. Annie's final effects has this deeply personal and religious image. Here, likely December 8th, 1920, she is at the family plot at Lowell's Edson Cemetery. Clara Wood, Annie's youngest sister, is in black. It would have been the 8th anniversary of her daughter's death from diphtheria. Annie Powell, the master of capturing expression, did so on this somber occasion. But she put more of her hand into the negative when she got back to the darkroom. Clara did not have a tattoo. Let's flip to a negative and notice the cross on her neck. Notice the skeleton on Clara's left hand. Not everybody agrees with me on this, but I see something like angel's wings drawn around her neck and chest. There was a double exposure technique invented by spirit or ghost photographers, as they were called. They were of the same tribe as mediums who supposedly communicated with the dead. Here, Annie's 1916 city engineer's photo shows her take. Let's look at the work that went into this strip. There are lots of translucent figures, double exposed. See the man walking out of the alley, men walking by the shine for 5 cents. There's even a levitating boy, possibly with a yo-yo. It's a good guess that this photo was a comment on the evils of the pool hall. One thing that makes me say that is a preponderance of ghostly men hanging out there. If you were the city engineers, you would probably see this photo and say, "Thanks, Annie. Good picture of the work we have to do on Bridge Street." But a closer look shows a highly choreographed, lurid story. In almost all of her allegories, there are ominous figures, often lurking, a person seemingly marked for death, divinely sent agents, spectral figures, and conveyances. The conveyances can be cars, trains, or horse wagons. Let's dive deeper. Is it possible to see this as a man next to a noose on the left and a spectral figure with not one but 2 lurking men? And a divinely sent horse carriage? A look at the front page news reveals what everybody was talking about at that time. In California, an 18-year-old would go to the gallows for the gruesome abduction and murder of a 12-year-old girl. Was this Annie's artistic sermon on the crime and the punishment? This is hard to see, especially small, but the man at the right is standing outside the Renier and Renier undertaker's office. This would be an actor, not the undertakers, who were a young sister-brother team. There is a shovel placed there, as if he is about to use it. He's looking intently at the man down the street, who is preoccupied by a book or a piece of paper. Is this a story or what? Something about a list of whose time is up? This is a construction site, but it has a similar trope of an undertaker type holding a piece of paper. Let's blow up this guy and put him side by side with the man in the previous photo. Is it the same gesture, holding a list of names? In this case, we also have a trench, which looks like it could be a dug grave. Remember we talked about conveyances in the religious allegory photos? What looks like a trolley behind the man would serve that purpose. And guess what? It's drawn in. Remember the handwriting class? They made the case for Annie Powell's block printing in municipal photos from 1916 to 1940. There are 3 other ways to link Annie to this work. We know who was paid for the flood photo. The invoice is listed in the 1923 City Auditor's Report. Was it Annie Powell? And we have packing slips for photos delivered to the city engineers. Second time we've seen Donaldson. Here's their ad. Could we just stop here and say the photos were taken by Donaldson's Camera and Art Shop? We certainly could. However, this was a family camera and gift shop. No photo studio, no photographers. In this ad, we see what they're marketing. A sleek, fit-in-your-handbag camera. Go and shoot, shoot and go. Wouldn't it have been off-message, lugging clunky old-school equipment in search of potholes? Let's look harder at the packing slip. Everything but the Donaldson stamp. Let's start with the writing on the side. And let's return to the block printing collage. The professor and 11 people in that lab a few weeks ago also considered this packing slip. They said it was the same person. They also studied the cursive handwriting on the packing slip. They compared it to Annie's known cursive handwriting. For instance, this church registration 9 years earlier. This is where she lists herself as head of household and sisters Emily and Selena in her household. The class was struck by the similarities. For one thing, they noted the quirky C's. Another thing, in a previous part of the lab, they observed Annie's difficulty in spelling throughout her life. Words she repeated a lot like Lowell, even family members, even her own name. In the church example, we're grateful to have the C in Selena for comparison to the other C, but spelled correctly, it would have been an S. And they noticed her struggle with the word engineers. Among other things, it looks like she reversed the N and the I. She did this elsewhere as well. Do you think she suffered from dyslexia? The evidence leads here. Donaldson had the contract. Donaldson subcontracted the work to Annie. Here is the second way to link Annie, or at least her studio, to municipal work. This is a Lowell Sun article many years later. The popular Man About Town column muses about a discovered photo which we know must have been taken around 1901. It shows a group of 5 men mixing concrete or asphalt on a city street. An advertisement on its back relates that it was made by John Powell, photographer, 55 South Whipple Street, who is no longer in business. A good candidate for this scene is this faded member of the city engineers collection. The railings on the Moody Street Bridge placed this around 1901 when the studio was active. As a bonus, this is Annie's likely block printing on the front and her cursive on the back. Finally, I had this idea. Could the dates on the city engineer's photos be seen as a work timeline? And could I match that timeline to Annie in her biographical timeline? I found two positive results to this concept. The first is when her husband died of an ulcer. The constant city engineer's workload halted 2 days before his death, possibly so she could attend him in his final hours. The workload resumed 10 days afterwards, possibly as she sewed up affairs, or even if the marriage was troubled, wouldn't she need time to grieve? Interesting, when the workload resumed, it was heavier than usual. The schedule suggested that the city engineers depended on its main photographer, Annie. The second would be when her older sister died by suicide. All work stops, as if at age 73, this may have been too much to bear. And in this collection, we never see Annie's work again. This is circumstantial evidence that Annie took the city engineer photos. Until she clicked the shutter again about 8 years later. She was on her own in her 80s without benefit from the new Social Security Act. She shared a low-rent room at 90 Congress Street with two unrelated roommates. She still had her bag of tricks. Still the photobomber. Still the ominous-looking man. Still the ghost figure from a careful double exposure. Still the mysterious artist who 100 years ago, hours after the angry heavens opened up, shared her unique vision of peace.